Chapter 6. In the Morning Room. Life at Mandalay was very carefully planned. The same things happened at the same time every day. I remember our first morning there very clearly. I had slept well and came downstairs a little after 9 o'clock. To my surprise, I found that Maxim had nearly finished his breakfast. Maxim looked up at me and smiled. "I always get up early here," he said. "Looking after Mandalay takes a lot of my time. I work very hard. But you don't have to. Help yourself to anything you want." I remember the size of that breakfast. It was the normal Mandalay breakfast, but far too much for 2 people. As I took an egg and some coffee, I wondered what happened to the food that was left. Would it be eaten or thrown away? I would never know, of course. I would certainly be too afraid to ask. "My sister Beatrice is coming over to lunch with her husband," Maxim told me. "She invited herself, of course. I suppose she wants to have a look at you." "They're coming today?" I said, feeling less happy than before. "Yes, but she won't stay long. I think you'll like Beatrice. She believes in telling the truth. If she doesn't like you, she'll tell you so." Maxim stood up and lit a cigarette. "I've so many things to do this morning. Why don't you go into the garden? You don't mind being alone, do you?" "Of course not," I said. "I shall be perfectly happy." But I did not feel very happy as Maxim walked out of the room. I had thought we would spend our first morning at Mandalay together. I had thought that perhaps we would walk down to the sea or sit under the great tree on the lawn. I finished my breakfast alone. I left the dining room and went into the library. The room was cold. The fire was laid but not lit. I looked round for a box of matches, but I could not find one. I went across the hall and into the dining room once more. Yes, there was a box of matches on the table. I picked it up. At that moment Frith came into the room. "Oh, Frith," I said awkwardly, "I could not find any matches. I thought I would light the fire in the library. It's rather cold in there."
"The fire in the library is not usually lit until the afternoon, madam," he said. "Mrs. De Winter always used the morning room before lunch. There's a good fire in there. Of course, I can give orders for the fire in the library to be lit."
"Oh, no," I said. "I'll go into the morning room. Thank you, Frith."
"Mrs. De Winter always wrote her letters in the morning room after breakfast. The house telephone is there too if you want to talk to Mrs. Danvers."
"Thank you, Frith," I said. I went into the hall again. I did not know which way to go. I could not tell Frith that I had never seen the morning room. Maxim had not shown it to me the night before.
"You go through the drawing room to the morning room, madam," Frith said, watching me. "Then turn to your left."
"Thank you, Frith," I said. I felt very stupid. I found my way into the little morning room. I was glad to see the dog Jasper there, sitting in front of the fire. The morning room was quite small and very different from the library. It was a woman's room, graceful and charming. Someone had chosen everything in this room with the greatest care. Each chair, each rug, each small ornament had been put there to make the room perfect. Flowers filled the room, glowing blood-red flowers. They were the same flowers we had seen in the drive. A beautiful old writing desk stood near the window. I went over and opened the desk carefully. Every drawer was labelled, and everything was in order. Inside one of the drawers was a flat leather book, Guests at Mandalay. I opened the book. The writing inside the book and the writing on the labels was the same. I had seen that tall, sloping writing before. It was Rebecca's writing. This was Rebecca's desk. I sat down and opened the guest book. Every page was covered with the same writing. I felt that Rebecca would come back into the room at any moment. The mistress of the house would come in and find me, a stranger, sitting at her desk. Suddenly the telephone on the desk began to ring. My heart jumped. I picked up the phone. "Who is it?" I said. "Who do you want?"
"Mrs. De Winter,"
said a hard, deep voice.
"Mrs. De Winter."
My hand was shaking. "I'm afraid you've made a mistake," I said. "Mrs. De Winter has been dead for over a year." I suddenly realised what I had said.
"It's Mrs. Danvers, madam," said the voice. "I'm speaking to you on the house telephone."
"I'm so sorry, Mrs. Danvers," I said. "I didn't know what I was saying. I did not expect the telephone to ring."
"I wondered if you had seen the menus for the day. You will find the list on the desk beside you."
I found the piece of paper and looked at it quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Danvers. Yes, very nice indeed."
"I'm very sorry to have disturbed you, madam."
"You didn't disturb me at all. Thank you, Mrs. Danvers," I said. I put down the phone and looked at the desk. I felt very stupid. Rebecca would not have answered like that. I thought of Rebecca sitting at that desk. Here she had chosen her guests and written letters to her friends. Who could I write to? I knew nobody. Then I thought of Mrs. Van Hopper, far away in New York. I took a piece of paper and a pen. "Dear Mrs. Van Hopper," I began. As I wrote, I noticed my own handwriting for the first time. How weak and childish it was. It was like the writing of a schoolgirl. Chapter 7. You Are So Very Different. When I heard the sound of a car in the drive, I stood up in sudden fear. Beatrice and her husband had arrived. They were earlier than I expected, and Maxim had not come back. I could not meet them by myself. I ran quickly out of the morning room. I took a door to the left. I was in a stone corridor. A servant stared at me in surprise. I hurried up some stairs, hoping that I could find my way to my bedroom in the east wing. I could stay there until Maxim came back. Somehow I lost my way, but I went on and came to a wide staircase. I went up it. All was quiet and dark. I was in a corridor with doors on either side. I walked on, and at last I came to a long window. I looked out. Below me I could see green lawns and the sea. The sea was bright green with white-topped waves. It was closer than I thought, much closer. I knew then that I had walked right round the house. I was standing in the corridor of the west wing. Yes, Mrs. Danvers was right. You could hear the sea from here. I was glad that my rooms were in the east wing. I loved the quiet beauty of the rose garden. The sea was too near here. As I turned to go back to the stairs, I heard a door open behind me. Mrs. Danvers stood there. We stared at one another for a moment without speaking. "I lost my way," I said. "I was trying to find my room."
"This is the west wing," she said. "Did you go into any of the rooms? If you wish to see them, please tell me. I could show them to you now."
I shook my head. No, thank you," I said. "I must go downstairs." As I began to walk towards the stairs, Mrs. Danvers followed me.
"If you want to see the rooms in the west wing, I can show them to you at any time."
"It's very kind of you, Mrs. Danvers," I said. "I will let you know." Mrs. Danvers walked beside me.
"Major and Mrs. Lacey have been here some time," she said. "Didn't you hear their car? Frith took them to the morning room. I think you know your way now, don't you?"
"Yes, Mrs. Danvers," I said.
I knew then that she had been watching me, laughing at my fear.
As I went into the drawing room, I looked back. Mrs. Danvers was still watching me from the top of the stairs. I could hear the sound of voices from the morning room. I stood for a moment and then walked in.
"Here she is at last," Maxim said. "Where have you been hiding? Here's Beatrice, and this is Giles, and this is Frank Crawley, our agent."
Beatrice was tall, broad-shouldered, and very much like Maxim. She shook hands with me and said to Maxim, She's quite different from what I expected. Not like your description at all." Everyone laughed, but they seemed friendly. Giles was a big, heavy man. His eyes smiled at me from behind his thick glasses. Frank Crawley was a thin man with a pleasant, worried face. Maxim had told me how hard Frank Crawley worked for Manderley. The men began to talk together, and I had to answer Beatrice's questions. "What do you think of Manderley?" she asked me. "I haven't seen much of it yet," I said. "The house is beautiful, of course. I haven't seen the gardens, but I'm sure I shall never get tired of them. I love walking. I can swim too when the weather is warmer." "My dear, the water is always far too cold here," said Beatrice. "I don't mind that. I love swimming. Is it safe to swim in the bays?" Everyone stopped talking. I realised what I had said. Rebecca had been drowned in the bay. I could not look at Maxim. I bent down to stroke the dog's head. Then, thank God, Frith came in to say that lunch was ready. Beatrice walked with me through the hall. "You know," she said, "you're much younger than I expected. Tell me, do you love Maxim very much?" Beatrice looked at my surprised face and laughed. "Don't answer," she said. "I can see that you do. Maxim looks very well. We were all very worried about him last year, but of course you know the whole story." But Beatrice was wrong. I did not know what had happened down in the bay. Maxim had told me nothing. I had never asked him about Rebecca's death. Beatrice talked to Maxim all through lunch. Frank Crawley told me a lot about Manderley. I could see that he loved it as much as Maxim did. When lunch was over, I could see that Maxim was tired. I wished we hadn't had visitors so soon. I took Beatrice out onto the terrace. She asked me how I had met Maxim. I told her about Mrs. Van Hopper and how surprised she had been. "It was rather a shock to us, too," Beatrice said. "Maxim said in his letter that you were very young and pretty. We expected a very modern sort of girl." Beatrice laughed, and I laughed with her. "Poor Maxim. He had a terrible time," Beatrice said. "Let's hope you have made him forget all about it. He loves Manderley so much, but you never know what he is thinking. How do you get on with Mrs. Danvers?" I was surprised by Beatrice's question. "She frightens me a little," I said. "She may try to make things unpleasant for you," Beatrice went on. "She's very jealous, of course. She must hate you being here." "Why?" I asked. "Why must she hate me being at Manderley?" "My dear child," Beatrice answered slowly, "I thought Maxim had told you. Mrs. Danvers adored Rebecca. She still does." At that moment the men came out of the house. A servant brought rugs and chairs, and we all sat under the great tree on the lawn. I hoped everyone would go soon. I wanted to be alone with Maxim. I was sitting on a rug, leaning against Maxim's chair. I listened to the others talking. The afternoon was sleepy and peaceful. Everything was quiet and still. Even the sea seemed far away. This is what I wanted, I thought. This is how I thought life at Manderley would be. This moment was safe. It could not be touched. Here we sat together, Maxim and I, hand in hand. The past and the future did not matter at all. At this moment I was not afraid. The moment passed. Beatrice stood up. "We must be going," she said. "We've got people coming to dinner." We all got up, and Giles looked up at the sky. "I'm afraid we're going to have some rain," he said. We all walked slowly back to the drive. Beatrice took my hand. Then she bent down and kissed me. "Forgive me if I've asked you a lot of rude questions, my dear. As I said before, you're not what we expected. You're so very different from Rebecca." As we reached the car, the sun went behind a cloud, and a little rain began to fall. Maxim and I watched the car drive away. We turned and walked back into the house. Chapter 8. The Happy Valley. As we stood in the hall, Maxim put his arm around my shoulders.
"Thank God that's over," he said. "Get a coat quickly and let's go out. Never mind the rain, I want to walk."
Maxim looked white and ill. Had Beatrice said something to make him angry? I could not remember. "Just a moment," I said. "I'll get my coat from upstairs."
"There are plenty of raincoats downstairs," Maxim said. "Robert, will you fetch a coat for Mrs. De Winter?"
Maxim was standing in the drive now, calling to Jasper.
"Come on, you lazy little fellow, you're too fat."
Jasper ran round in circles, barking loudly. The young servant, Robert, ran out of the hall carrying a raincoat. I put it on quickly. It was too big, of course, and too long, but Maxim was waiting impatiently and there was no time to change the coat. We set off together across the lawns to the woods. Jasper ran on in front.
"I soon get tired of my family," Maxim said. "Beatrice is very kind-hearted, but she always says the wrong thing."
I was not sure what Beatrice had said, and I thought it better not to ask.
"What did you think of Beatrice?" Maxim asked me. "What did she talk to you about after lunch?"
"I think I did most of the talking," I said. "I was telling her about how we met. She said I was quite different from what she expected."
"What on earth did she expect?"
"Someone much smarter, I think. A modern young woman." Maxim did not answer. He bent down and threw a stick for Jasper to run after. We climbed the grass bank above the lawns and walked down into the woods. The trees grew very close together over our heads and it was very dark. We walked on last year's leaves. The green shoots of flowers were beginning to show through. Jasper was silent now, with his nose to the ground. We came to a clearing in the woods. There were two paths going in opposite directions. Jasper ran on ahead and took the right-hand path without waiting for us.
"Not that way," called Maxim. "Come on, old boy."
The dog looked back at us. He stood there wagging his tail. "Why does he want to go that way?" I asked.
"I suppose he's used to it," Maxim said quickly. "It leads to a small bay where we used to keep a boat. Come on, Jasper, old boy. This way."
We turned onto the left-hand path, not saying anything. I looked over my shoulder and saw that Jasper was following us.
"This path brings us to the valley I told you about," Maxim told me. "You can smell the flowers already. Never mind the rain, it will bring out the scent."
Maxim seemed all right again now, happy and cheerful. He began talking about Frank Crawley. He told me what a good agent he was and how he loved Mandalay. I held Maxim's arm and looked up into his face. Talking about Mandalay always made Maxim happy again. We had reached the top of a small hill. The path ran down into a little valley by the side of a stream.
"There," said Maxim. "Look at that."
There were no dark trees in this valley, no thick bushes. On either side of the narrow path stood high, graceful bushes covered with flowers. The flowers were pink, white, and gold. They were things of beauty and grace. The soft summer rain fell and the air was full of a sweet scent. There was no sound except for the noise of a little stream and the quiet rain on the leaves. When Maxim spoke, his voice was gentle and low.
"We call it the Happy Valley," he said.
We stood still, not speaking. I looked down at the clear white flowers. Maxim picked up a fallen flower and gave it to me. As I rubbed it between my hands, the scent was sweet and strong. A bird began to sing, a high, clear sound. Other birds began to sing too. I had never been in so beautiful a place. As we walked along the path, drops of rain fell on my hands and face. I held Maxim's hand. The Happy Valley was the heart of Mandalay. The Mandalay I would soon know and love. Chapter 9. The Cottage in the Bay. We came to the end of the path. The bushes made an arch over our heads so that we had to bend down. I stood straight again, brushing the rain from my head. I saw that the valley was behind us. We were standing in a little narrow bay. There, almost at our feet, was the sea. Maxim looked down at me, smiling at the surprise on my face. "It is a surprise, isn't it?" he said. "No one ever expects it." Maxim picked up a stone and threw it across the beach for Jasper. "Fetch it, good boy," he said. Jasper ran after the stone, barking with excitement. We both went down to the water's edge and threw more stones. The tide was coming up into the bay and the water was beginning to cover the stones. Maxim turned to me, laughing and wiping the hair out of his eyes. I rolled up the long sleeves of the raincoat. It was a happy moment. Then we saw that Jasper had gone. We called and whistled, but he did not come. "Has he gone back to the Happy Valley?" I asked. "He was by that rock a minute ago," said Maxim. We walked up the beach towards the valley again. "Jasper! Jasper!" called Maxim. In the distance, beyond a line of rocks to the right of the beach, I heard a sharp bark. "Do you hear that?" "He's gone over this way." I began to climb up the wet rocks. "Come back," Maxim said sharply. "We don't want to go that way." "I must get him," I said. "He may be hurt." "He's all right," said Maxim. "Leave him. He knows the way home." I began climbing over the rocks towards Jasper. I thought Maxim was being very unkind. I got to the top of the largest rock and looked beyond it. There was another bay. A small stone wall across the bay made it into a small harbour. In the bay was a green and white buoy, but no boat. The woods came right down to the shore. At the edge of the woods was a low stone building, a cottage or a boathouse. There was a man standing on the shore dressed like a fisherman. Jasper was barking at him and running round and round. The man took no notice of the dog. "Jasper!" I shouted. "Jasper, come here!" The dog looked up, but he did not come to me. I looked back, but I could not see Maxim. I climbed down into the bay, and the man looked at me for the first time. There was something strange about him. He had small, stupid-looking eyes. His face was fat and round, and he had thick red lips. "Bad weather, isn't it?" the man said with a stupid smile. "It's not very nice weather," I said. "Come on, Jasper. We must go home now." But Jasper ran away, barking. "Have you got any string?" I asked the man. "I want something to tie the dog. He won't follow me." "I know that dog. It's not yours. It comes from the house." "He's Mr. De Winter's dog," I said kindly. "I must take him back." The man said nothing, but stared at me in the same stupid way. I walked up the shore to the cottage. Perhaps there was some string there. The grass round the little house had grown very long. The windows had pieces of wood over them. I pushed at the door. To my surprise, it opened, and I went inside. The room was furnished, and there were books on the shelves, but everything was covered with thick dust. The air was damp and still. Another door at the end of the room led into a small boathouse. I saw some string on a shelf and an old knife. I cut a piece of string for Jasper and went out of the cottage. There was something frightening about that small, dark room. I was glad to be outside again. The man was still watching me, staring like a child. Jasper was quiet now, and let me tie the string. "I saw you go in there," the man said. "She doesn't go in there now. She's gone in the sea. She won't come back, will she?" "No," I said. "She won't come back." "I didn't say anything, did I?" The man's eyes were full of fear. He turned away and walked back towards the sea. Maxim was waiting for me beside the rocks. He looked angry. "I'm sorry," I said. "I had to get some string for Jasper. Who is that man?" "That's Ben. He's a bit mad, but he won't hurt you. Where did you get that string? I found it in the cottage. The door was open. There's dust everywhere. The place ought to be cleaned. The door should be locked, Maxim said. He was walking very fast now. He went up past the cottage and onto the path through the woods. It was very different here from the Happy Valley. The path was steep and the trees were thick and dark. It was cold now, and my legs ached. Jasper was tired too and walked very slowly.
"Come on, Jasper, for God's sake," said Maxim angrily. "Pull at that string, can't you?" he said to me.
"It's your fault," I said. "You walk so fast."
"If you had listened to me, we would be home by now. There was no need for you to go after Jasper."
"I thought you would come with me," I answered.
"Why should I run after the damned dog?" Maxim said, not looking at me.
"That's an excuse. You didn't want to go over the rocks," I answered.
"All right, I didn't. I didn't want to go to the other bay. I never go near the place or that damned cottage. If you had my memories, you would not go there either. You wouldn't talk about it or even think about it."
Maxim's face was white. His eyes had a dark, lost look. I took his hand and held it tight. "Please, Maxim, please," I said. "I don't want you to look like that. I'm sorry, darling. Please don't let us quarrel."
"We should have stayed in Italy," Maxim said. "I was a fool to bring you back to Mandalay."
I had to run to keep up with him now. At last we came to the top of the path and out onto the lawn. Maxim's face was hard. He walked straight into the house and spoke to Frith.
"We want tea at once," said Maxim.
Then he went quickly into the library and shut the door. I tried to keep back my tears. Frith must not see them. I turned away as he helped me off with the raincoat. He picked up a handkerchief.
"Is this yours, madam?" he said.
I put the handkerchief in my pocket and walked slowly across the hall to the library. Maxim was sitting in his usual chair with Jasper at his feet. I walked across the room and knelt down by Maxim's chair. "Don't be angry with me any more," I said. Maxim looked down at me.
"I'm not angry with you," he said.
"But I've made you unhappy," I replied. "I want you to be happy so much. I love you."
"Do you?"
he said. His eyes were full of pain and fear. "What is it, darling?" I said. "Why do you look like that?" The door opened before Maxim could answer. It was Frith and Robert with the tea. The small table was put near the fire and covered with the white cloth. Frith brought in the silver teapot and kettle. Then came the cups, the sandwiches and cakes. Everything was the same as yesterday. When the servants had gone, I looked at Maxim's face. The colour had come back into it. He took a sandwich.
"Pour me a cup of tea, darling," he said to me. "And forgive me for being so unkind."
There was nothing more to say. Maxim smiled at me and picked up his paper. Maxim's smile was like a pat on the head given to Jasper. I was not hungry and I felt very tired. I gave Jasper a piece of cake and took out the handkerchief to wipe my hands. The handkerchief was not mine. It must have come from the raincoat pocket. There were some letters in the corner, a tall R and DW. It was Rebecca's. The raincoat, too wide, too long for me, must have been hers too. Rebecca had worn that raincoat. She had left the handkerchief in the pocket. I could smell a scent I knew. I shut my eyes and tried to remember what it was. Suddenly I knew. The scent on the handkerchief was the scent of the flowers in the Happy Valley. Was there nowhere I could escape from Rebecca? Chapter 10. Questions and Answers. The weather was wet and cold for over a week. We did not go down to the beach again. I could see the sea from the terrace and the lawns. It looked cold and grey. When I stood on the terrace, I could hear the sound of great waves on the shore. I began to understand why some people hated the low, angry voice of the sea. I was glad that our rooms were in the east wing. If I could not sleep, I went to the window and looked out onto the rose garden. I was not troubled by the sea's unhappy music. Sometimes I thought about the cottage down in the bay. There were so many questions I wanted to ask Maxim. I could not forget the lost look in Maxim's eyes. I could not forget his words. I was a fool to bring you back to Mandalay. It was all my fault. I had gone down into the bay. I had reminded Maxim of the past. We lived our lives together, sleeping, eating, walking. But every hour of the day, the past made a wall between us. I became nervous and afraid. I did not want anyone to talk about the sea or boats. When visitors came to Mandalay, I was shy and awkward. I knew that they compared me with Rebecca. She had been charming, interested in everyone. I was dull and stupid like a schoolgirl. One afternoon, I was having tea alone when the wife of the bishop called. She was a kind woman and tried hard to make me talk. At last she said, "Will your husband hold the Mandalay fancy dress ball this year? I remember the last one so well. It was such a lovely sight. I shall never forget it." I smiled and said, "We have not decided. There have been so many things to do." I could not tell the woman that Maxim had never spoken about the ball. "Mandalay looked so beautiful," the bishop's wife went on, "and there was dancing and music and flowers everywhere." "Yes," I said, "yes. I must ask Maxim about it." "We came to a garden party too one summer," the bishop's wife went on. "It was a lovely day. We all had tea in the rose garden. It was such a clever idea. Of course, she was a clever person." She stopped, her face rather red. I heard myself saying, "Rebecca must have been a wonderful person." I had said her name at last. Rebecca. I had said it aloud. "You never met her then?" the woman asked. "Oh, yes, she was a lovely person, so full of life. Everyone loved her." "She was so good at everything too," I said. "Clever, beautiful, and fond of sport." "Rebecca was certainly beautiful," my visitor went on. "I remember her on the night of the ball. She had a cloud of dark hair. Her skin was very white, and she had such a lovely dress." "She looked after everything in the house too," I said. "I'm afraid I leave it all to the housekeeper." "Oh, well, you are very young, aren't you? We can't all do everything. I must go now. Do ask your husband to have another ball." "Yes, of course I will." I sat in the library after my visitor had gone. I thought about Mandalay, full of people in beautiful costumes, dancing in the hall. I thought of Rebecca, lively and beautiful, arranging everything. What must people think about me? I suddenly sat up straight. I did not mind. I did not care. I was Mrs. De Winter now, not Rebecca. I decided that I would find out more about the fancy dress ball, but I did not want to ask Maxim. Later that afternoon, Frank Crawley came up to the house. "I've been hearing about the fancy dress ball, Frank," I said. "I did not know you had dances here." Frank did not reply at once. Then he said, "The Mandalay ball was held every year. People came from miles around. They even came down from London." "It must have been a lot of work," I said. "I suppose Rebecca did most of it." Frank looked straight ahead. "We all helped," he said. "Will you ask Maxim about the ball?" I asked. "It does seem a good idea." Frank did not answer me. "I went into that cottage in the bay a few days ago," I said. It's very dirty. Why doesn't someone do something about it?"
"Maxim would tell me if he wanted anything done," Frank replied.
"Are they Rebecca's things?" I asked.
"Yes,"
Frank said. "Did Rebecca use the cottage a lot?"
"Yes, she did. She slept in the cottage sometimes. She had moonlight picnics on the shore."
I noticed that Frank always called Rebecca she. He never used her name. "Why is there a buoy in the bay?" I asked. "There's no boat there. What happened to it? Was it the boat Rebecca was sailing when she died?"
"Yes,"
said Frank quietly.
"It turned over and sank. She was washed overboard and drowned. The sea is sometimes very rough in the bay."
"Couldn't anyone have helped her?" I asked.
"Nobody saw the accident. Nobody knew she was sailing. She often went out alone like that."
"When did they find her?" I felt I must know everything now. I had been thinking about that terrible night for so long.
"They found her 2 months later. The sea had carried her 40 miles up the coast. Maxim had to identify the body."
Suddenly I was ashamed of all my questions. "Frank," I said, "I'm sorry I asked you all those questions. But everything is so strange to me at Mandalay. And when I meet anyone new, I know what they're thinking. How different she is from Rebecca."
"Mrs. De Winter, you mustn't think that," said Frank, looking at me for the first time. "I am so glad you have married Maxim. It will make such a difference to his life. And Mandalay needs someone like you, someone young, fresh and charming."
"But Rebecca was so charming and clever. People still remember her."
"Maxim will be very unhappy to hear you talking like this, Mrs. De Winter. Forget the past, as Maxim has done. None of us want to bring back the past. Your job here is to lead us away from it."
I was much happier now, but I had to ask Frank one more question. "Tell me, Frank," I said, "was Rebecca very beautiful?" Frank turned away from me so that I could not see his face.
"Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, I suppose she was the most beautiful woman I ever saw in my life."
Chapter 11. The China Cupid. I did not see very much of Mrs. Danvers. She sent the menus to the morning room every day. She rang me every morning on the house telephone. She had also found a maid for me called Clarice. Clarice was new to Mandalay, and this was her first job. Her family lived near Mandalay, but she had never known Rebecca. To Clarice, I was an important person, because I was Mrs. De Winter. Mrs. Danvers was certainly an excellent housekeeper, and I began to lose my fear of her. Sometimes I felt sorry for Mrs. Danvers. It must hurt her to call me Mrs. De Winter when all the time she was thinking about Rebecca. Frank had told me to forget the past. I wanted to, but Frank did not sit in the morning room every day as I did. He did not sit at Rebecca's desk and touch the things she had touched. Dear God, I did not want to think about Rebecca. I wanted to be happy. I wanted Maxim to be happy too, but Rebecca was always in my thoughts and dreams. Beatrice, Maxim's sister, had promised to give me a wedding present. She did not forget. One day Robert brought a large parcel into the morning room where I was sitting alone. I cut the string excitedly and tore off the dark brown paper. Beatrice had sent me 4 big books about painting. She knew that I enjoyed sketching, and she had really tried to please me. I was glad to have something at Mandalay that belonged to me. I looked round the room for somewhere to put the books. I stood them in a row on top of the desk and looked at them. But the books were far too heavy. First one fell, and then the others followed. A little china ornament, which always stood on the desk, was knocked onto the floor. The ornament broke into many pieces. It was a beautiful little Cupid, and one of the loveliest things in the house. I was suddenly very frightened. I found an envelope in the drawer and carefully put the pieces of china into it. Then, like a child, I hid the envelope in the desk. I decided to put my new books in the library, and I said nothing about the Cupid. The following day after lunch, Frith brought our coffee to the library as usual. Instead of leaving, he stood by Maxim's chair.
"Could I speak to you, sir?"
he said. Maxim looked up from his paper. "Yes, Frith, what is it?"
"It's about Robert, sir. He's very upset. Mrs. Danvers has accused him of taking a valuable ornament from the morning room. Mrs. Danvers noticed it was missing late this morning. She says that Robert must have taken it or broken it. Robert says he knows nothing about it."
"Perhaps it was one of the maids," said Maxim. I knew he hated any kind of trouble with the servants.
"No, sir. No one except Robert has been in the room, apart from Madam, of course. Mrs. Danvers doesn't let the maids clean the morning room."
"Well, Mrs. Danvers had better come and see me. What ornament was it?"
"The china Cupid, sir. It stands on the desk."
"Oh dear," said Maxim. "That's very valuable. It must be found. I'll see Mrs. Danvers at once."
"Very good, sir,"
said Frith, and quietly left the room. "Darling," I said to Maxim when we were alone, "I meant to tell you before, but I forgot. I broke the Cupid yesterday."
"You broke it? Why didn't you say so when Frith was here? You'll have to explain to Mrs. Danvers now."
"Oh, no. Please, Maxim, you tell her. Let me go upstairs."
"Don't be silly," said Maxim angrily. "Anyone would think you were afraid of Mrs. Danvers."
"I am afraid of her. At least, not afraid, but—" The door opened without a sound, and Mrs. Danvers came into the room. I looked nervously at Maxim. His face was half amused, half angry.
"It's all a mistake, Mrs. Danvers," Maxim told her. "Mrs. De Winter broke the Cupid herself. She forgot to tell us."
I felt like a child again. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I never thought Robert would get into trouble."
"Is it possible to repair the Cupid, madam?" said Mrs. Danvers.
She did not seem surprised. I felt she had known the truth all the time. "I'm afraid not," I said. "It's in hundreds of pieces."
"What did you do with the pieces?" said Maxim.
"They are in an envelope in a drawer of the writing desk."
"Find the pieces, Mrs. Danvers. Try to get them mended in London." "I never thought that Mrs. De Winter had broken the ornament," said Mrs. Danvers. As she left the room, I could see the scorn and hatred in her eyes.
"I'm very sorry, darling," I said. "It was very silly and careless of me."
"Forget it," said Maxim. "But you do act strangely sometimes. More like a servant than the mistress of Mandalay. Even when we have visitors, you sit on the edge of your chair and say only yes and no."
"I can't help being shy."
"I know you can't, darling. But you must learn to hide it."
"I do try, but I'm not used to this kind of life. People look at me and ask me so many questions."
"What does it matter? They are interested in us, that's all."
"They can't find me very interesting," I said. "I suppose that's why you married me. You knew I was dull and quiet. No one would ever gossip about me." Maxim threw his paper on the ground and got up from his chair. His face was dark with anger and his voice was hard.
"What do you know about any gossip down here?" he said. "Who's been talking to you?"
"No one. No one at all." Maxim stared at me.
"Perhaps I did a very selfish thing when I married you," he said slowly. "I am so much older than you."
I felt cold and frightened. "Age doesn't matter," I said. "I'm happy. You know I love you more than anything else in the world. I love Mandalay too. I love everything here. You're happy too, darling, aren't you? Maxim did not answer. He stood staring out of the window. If you don't think we're happy, you must tell me, I went on. I don't want you to lie to me. Maxim took my face in his hands. How can I answer you? He said. If you are happy, then we are both happy. He kissed me and walked across the room. But you are disappointed in me. You think I'm not right for Mandalay. If only I hadn't broken that Cupid. Was it very valuable? I think so, Maxim answered. It was a wedding present. Rebecca knew a lot about China. Maxim went on staring straight in front of him. He is thinking about Rebecca, I said to myself. I have broken one of their wedding presents. Maxim went back to his chair and picked up his paper. I sat on the long seat under the window. After a time, Jasper came to me and climbed onto my lap.